Well, Happy New Year. And it's a frosty, icy January. And what I like to do at the beginning of every episode is put this in history. So what's happening now? Well, we're starting to hear Donald Trump's plans for the future. A renamed Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Hints at raising the possibility of invading Denmark and Panama. And the social media giants this week have been changing the rules of, let's call it, conversation on the internet. Welcome to the Internet Seriously. I'm Lucian Taylor in Oxford.
I'm Emily Taylor in Oxford.
And I'm Kieran McCarthy in freezing London.
And today, we can't avoid the weather, can we? We keep coming back to it. It's British, that's what it is. But I'm really excited to announce our guest this week, which is Eleanor Dews, partner and head of data and privacy at Bates Wells. Eleanor, hello.
Hello, great to be here. Thank you so much.
Good to see you. And before we have a conversation with you, Emily's going to talk about that. Coming up today, in the UK, the pound has fallen to its lowest level in over a year, and government borrowing costs have surged to their highest level in 16 years. Economists warn of further tax rises and or possibly cuts in spending, and how will this impact on the tech industry? And big other news this week, which we can't ignore. Mark Zuckerberg announces a U-turn on fact-checking on Meta platforms whilst wearing a $900,000 Swiss watch. Where are we heading with free speech on the internet, and what do we think about the $900,000 watch? Right, there we go. Before I hand over to Emily to talk to Eleanor, please subscribe to this channel. We need you to like and share. You can see the buttons on the screen now. We need the crowd. We've got a bigger and bigger crowd joining us each week, which is fantastic. But please do subscribe and join. Thank you. Emily.
Eleanor, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You were going to be here in person, but it's just so cold and icy out there.
Well, yes, let's talk about the weather.
Let's talk about the weather. Let's not talk about law. Let's talk about the weather.
I thought, Eleanor, you had Swedish blood in you. I thought it was all ice tyres and things like this.
What would a Swede make of this
weather? I
thought
this would be fine. You weren't able to venture up as far as Oxford because it was cold?
A Swede would be appalled that in the temperature of merely -3, I couldn't make it. But I don't have all the kit. I don't have the car with the winter tyres, and I just thought,
and you don't
like
and,
out there.
we're just not set up for this sort of weather, are we?
I'm not.
In Sweden, it must be a complete breeze. This sort of only -3. What are you complaining about? Let's go on holiday. Let's do some swimming.
I'm not even going to start to talk about my mother-in-law's journey last night in an electric car in the dark. No. I'm not going to go there.
No, it was a Thelma and Louise moment. But Eleanor, you were, am I right? You were the UK's chief negotiator, or part of the negotiating team that negotiated the General Data Protection Regulation, known as GDPR. So that is it's really the flagship EU tech policy instrument. And, now, what are we? We're now 6-7 years in to the GDPR regime. And it would be really great to hear, how it's going compared to your expectations at the time when you negotiated that piece of legislation.
Absolutely. Yes, I was the lead lawyer, so I spent many hours in Brussels debating all of this. And personally, I had some real misgivings, and so did others, about what we were doing here. This enormously broad piece of legislation applying to every organisation in Europe and promising these incredibly powerful rights, and also applying extraterritorially. And we had real questions about how's that really going to work? Are you really sure that when you send the data abroad, it's going to be protected to this very high standard?
Can you just help me on the extraterritorially? I mean, it's a rhetorical question. I kind of guess it, but just for people who don't know what that means. So basically, Europe's making a law and it doesn't just affect Europe, is that right?
Exactly. So if you're linked to a European company or you're targeting the EU market, the idea is that you're still subject to those laws. So it's incredibly broad. But also, if you're receiving data from the EU, you have to apply these protections. So many organisations outside the EU are actually possibly, unbeknown to them, caught by this incredibly onerous set of rules. There was a lot of debate. In fact, that there were such misgivings, really, that it felt for a long time as if we weren't making any progress at all, because people were just saying, firstly, the drafting's a bit unclear here, putting in more and more drafting. I think drafting law in a committee is quite difficult to get it clear enough, but also just the really high standards we had some concerns about. In the end, it sort of rushed through at a political level, and all of the things that we were concerned about really remained in the text. And as things have played out over the last 6 or 7 years, I feel that a lot of our misgivings were absolutely right. I think the standards are so high. There's this lovely story about somebody going round in a data protection conference wearing a T-shirt which said, "Only God is GDPR compliant." And I often think of that when I'm talking to clients about it, because actually no one is fully compliant. And I think there's a real question mark there about, is it right to be putting out laws that no one can comply with? In a democracy, you would expect that, other countries that don't really believe in democracy do this deliberately. They have laws that no one can comply with, so everyone is vulnerable. And I really think in a properly democratic system, we shouldn't have laws which are aspirational but not enforceable.
And I mean, I've really seen the impact of the long arm jurisdiction in international discussions about domain policy and who is, for example, and really seen a culture clash between US participants and European ones. So the US participants come to this law, they're like, this has turnover-based fines. We've looked, it applies to us, or it might apply to us. Frankly, our data isn't segregated geographically in the way that we would like it to be, so we're just having to apply it across the board, and we're going to take a zero-risk approach here. So we're going to absolutely try to make sure that GDPR doesn't comply to us. But they take it so seriously. And I sense that, the Europeans who've lived in a data protection regime for now, 30 years, they're much more relaxed about it than the Americans. But it's really disrupted cross-border data flows, especially for law enforcement, hasn't it? Do you sense that sort of, difference between the US and the EU type of approach on it?
Definitely. I mean, I think trying to explain how this works to US clients who don't know much about it, it's hard. It's a completely different approach to what they're used to. It does apply extraterritorially, so they need to know about it and they need to comply with it. But there is sometimes a situation where you are in a real dilemma, because the US law is telling you to do one thing and the EU law tells you to do another. And putting companies in that position is really invidious, particularly where we need those cross-border data flows. So much of our data is stored in the US. We need that tech power to run our companies and to store our data. And we're all being put in a position which is incredibly difficult. And I think the EU deliberately really wanted to export GDPR as a statement of its values, but didn't really think about, how is this going to work where other jurisdictions don't accept those values? So I think they've created some real problems there that it's impossible for organisations to resolve. It really needs government to sit down and have an honest conversation, both within the EU, but also with partners. How do we do this properly? Because cross-border data flow is absolutely key. I mean, the International Chamber of Commerce has said that now cross-border data flows are more valuable than the global trade in goods, and I think they're going to contribute $11 trillion this year to the global economy. And all our new technologies need personal data. They're that's what powers them, really. So those cross-border data flows really could enhance the technologies that we're trying to develop, which could be so positive for the world. But we're hampering that by not really accepting and coming together and applying some realistic and common standards.
And Eleanor, just hallelujah to that. I mean, we feel that very much with a new project that we're doing with Google and others, which requires cross-border data flows for threat intelligence sharing. And I'm fascinated by how we can resolve all of that in the light of GDPR. But also a pet hate of mine is new cookie notices, and that we're sort of almost bombarded with cookie notices, which are very heavy, very gaming us, to actually I've got software on my browser that tries to automatically dismiss cookie notices, and in the most negative way I can, i.e. not agree, I don't want to agree. But with some of them you have to go through pages and pages and pages of vendor disagreement as well. I mean, you didn't actually write this stuff, did you? You were actually on the.
Don't blame Eleanor.
I'm not. I'm trying to carve.
Come on the show.
I'm trying to.
She specialised in the cookie.
It's her. I'm trying not to. No, I'm trying to carve this out and say, Eleanor, your role in this was to sort of be a voice, wasn't it? You weren't sitting there writing the whole thing.
No, I mean, it was written by the European Commission, by the lawyers in the European Commission, and we commented on it. And I have to say, the UK, I think, was a very pragmatic voice in the EU. We sort of said, how is this actually going to work in practice? So it was those sorts of comments. And sometimes we weren't very popular. There's one delegation, I won't mention them. Every time we put up our flag to say we wanted to speak, and we'd say, not sure about this, they'd come in and say, we completely disagree with the UK. Yeah. Then we had lunch with them and they said, we've been told we have to disagree with you because you're so Eurosceptic, but we actually agree with everything
you say. Yes. Kieran, over to you for a question or two for Eleanor.
Well, so sort of leading on from that, I mean, here's a question that you're not going to love, which is Brexit, right? So we're now out of the EU. Is there? We've been hunting around for some kind of benefit for however many years now. Is there an actual legislative benefit possibly to find our way through, come up with laws that benefit the UK by not going this sort of slightly unusual EU route?
I think that's certainly possible in theory, but what I've really noticed since Brexit is that this idea of the Brexit dividend, of doing things differently, just doesn't seem to be being delivered on. So we're reforming our data protection law. Potentially we could have done something brilliant here. We could have really simplified it and future-proofed it, because I think these really detailed laws are really problematic. We're already seeing GDPR doesn't quite fit with, the EU AI Act, for example. So I think this was an opportunity to do something different. But the government isn't doing that. They're sticking with the same rules. They're not really changing them. There's a bill going through making a few tweaks to UK GDPR. But there's a real absence, I think, of policy and vision on what Brexit could mean. And instead, I think we're sort of trailing behind, not quite sure what we're doing, and we'll probably just have to implement a lot of EU rules that we weren't at the table to negotiate.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
I think you're totally
I remember
right. But
at the time of Brexit, I think it was a government official from one of the Nordic countries said, yeah, but what about us? If the UK leaves, and it's a bit like what you were saying, Eleanor, the UK was a moderating, pragmatic voice in the negotiations. And since the Brexit, that voice has been, has gone, really. And a lot of the smaller countries that perhaps would have a moderate and pragmatic approach are in such a minority now. That it seems like the EU have gone, like, how many pieces of digital legislation are there that have come out of the EU now?
I was going to say the same thing, which is that they seem to have taken GDPR, which is literally a bogeyman in the corporate world, and said, "Oh, this worked really well. Let's do this again." So we've got NIS 2, which does a little bit of that. We've got the AI Act, which does a little bit of that. So you're speaking our language. I think we've all the people pragmatically doing this have been driven a bit mad by this legislation. So, why does the EU think that this was a success?
Well, it has been exported. I mean, so many jurisdictions have got similar laws now. But I don't think the EU, if it's really honest, and I think that the Draghi report that came out, which sort of talked about how we're going to get growth in Europe, I think this recognises that actually GDPR was a huge burden, and is a huge burden to organisations, and isn't really improving people's privacy rights. It still is the Wild West out there. You know, things like privacy notices that are supposed to be so privacy enhancing would take over a month to read all the privacy notices that we're supposed to be looking at when our data's being used. So it is all just a bit of a fiction, quite frankly.
It's become a tech game.